So I was lucky enough recently to catch up with Charlotte Harding on a piece of music that she's written for me recently, which is going to be featured on my upcoming album called Overflow. I just want to give you a little bit of context before I show this short chat that I had with her about the way that she writes music. So this piece of music that she's written for me is a commission from me. I asked her to write me a solo tenor sax piece, and what she actually sent back was a solo tenor sax piece with an 808 kick drum track, which was really, really exciting to see. Straight away, I got in touch with her and said, can we discuss this further? What do you have planned for the piece? And it was at that point where she said that what she hoped to do was for me to record the sax part, and then for her to then manipulate those sounds further through certain digital audio interfaces and put certain effects on the sax to build up that sound world even further. There were certain things that we had to discuss, so certain possibilities on the sax, certain techniques on the saxophone. We went through things like singing into the instrument at the same time as playing to create different sounds, growls. There's some interesting language used as direction in the music as well, which we will discuss in this short chat that we had. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of context about this piece before we dive into the conversation that we had, and hopefully it'll give you more of an idea of how Charlotte writes, how I was responding to what she'd written, and then where we plan to take this project next, because it's an ongoing project. We've not got to the end of it yet. Charlotte's still got to manipulate those sounds and send it back to me for me to possibly do some more recordings on top of that. Really, really exciting chat with Charlotte where she discusses in a little bit more detail about how she writes, how she got into using these electronic sounds in her music, and what she then hopes to do in the future. Some very, very exciting plans that she's got when it comes to notation and incorporating this electronic side of music with the acoustic side a lot more closely. So without further ado, I think we'll join the conversation just as we're starting to talk about the way that we might present this piece of music. So I started talking about the way that I envisaged some lighting, some interesting way of filming me performing this piece with some interesting lighting effects as well. And then she takes off and talks about how she thinks about music and how she visualizes music as she's writing something, which is really, really interesting. So without further ado, here we go with a quick chat with Charlotte Harding. Do you have any ideas? I mean, obviously that lighting thing is something that I want to experiment with and try and do a little bit more. Did you just mentioned the visual thing though? Have you got any ideas, or did you have any thoughts about how it could be? Because you've done something recently, haven't you, with the interesting visuals and the electronic sounds that you've got?
Yeah, like I don't know, I really like thinking in terms of shapes. So for like a piece like this, to me, it's totally these kind of like, lines that are sort of parallel but not parallel at the same time. And this kind of geometric kind of interplay, I guess, between the kick and the sax. And I mean, I think what's really exciting when you add the electronic element is that you suddenly get this sense of dimension to the sound. So everything becomes a little bit more 3D, I guess, as opposed to 2D. So yeah, I could really visualize, like, I think especially with lights, this idea of having a beam of light and then it kind of goes out into a spray of light, or like, that kind of thing. I really love there's an electronic artist called Max Cooper, and he works a lot with I think it's Kevin McLaughlin and all sorts of other visual artists, and it's quite a stylized thing. They do a lot of these videos, where it's kind of repeated elements, so like a circle, and then there'll be lots of circles, or it'll be like one thing and it'll kind of stagger, and yeah, I think that kind of weirdly, and this is a strange tangent, but it's that kind of minimalism relation to New York. You know how like the whole Steve Reich looks like the buildings in New York because it's all very lines and shapes and that kind of thing. Yeah, I have a theory that Max Cooper is that kind of thing. So yeah, that's what I would envisage with this. And it's two very much sort of two interweaving lines that kind of come in and out of these kind of dimensions. But yeah, it would be very cool to explore that in terms of light. And then yeah.
So just on that then, do you think when you're writing, do you think visually? When
Yeah.
you write something like this?
Totally. Yeah. I really like thinking in terms of shapes and lines, and
Mm,
like a lot of the time I'll make a graphic score for something before I even start. That's just,
okay.
I mean, it looks terrible, but it's like it's just sort of squiggles and blocks and shapes and yeah, that kind of, I think with a piece like this, it's kind of finding the shape within the hooks and the kind of constructions of the arpeggios and that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um yeah, I think it's a really, I don't know. I've always thought like that, like visual kind of either visual shapes and lines or narratives. Kind of a
Mm,
picture or a scene or something going on.
yeah.
I've always liked to, yeah,
Yeah. I suppose
fix
it's
that
always
too.
nice to have something to refer back to as well, isn't it? And see where you're up to
Mm,
in that.
yeah, definitely, definitely, and always nice to be like, okay, this is like the material that I have in quite a sort of visual. It's on a piece of paper, and then you can literally chop up the piece of paper and be like, okay, try it like that, or move it
Yeah.
around. Yeah, I've always quite liked sort of thinking of things in that way. And I think especially with electronic music as well, like there is a very kind of, I don't know, it to me it just all sounds very visual, like anything sort of synthesized. It's just
Mm,
got that very because you're never quite sure what's making the sound. So I think in your head you have to kind of attach something to it and be like, you don't know whether it's coming from a synth or an instrument or something. So
yeah.
it kind of lends
I guess
itself,
there
I
is
think,
that
quite
more
nicely.
manipulation, almost that physical thing of you doing something with something that exists as well, isn't there? Of shifting things around and
Yeah,
moving things around. Um,
totally. I think I quite like it because it's quite hands-on. I
yeah.
think sometimes as a composer, a lot of the time, you write something, you send it off, someone plays it, and then obviously, you have a relationship and a rehearsal of like, so molding it a little bit, but it's I don't know, I love kind of getting things back into Logic and then sort of getting your hands dirty and just playing around with it. And I mean, it's very nice when you have wonderful musicians like yourself who are happy for me to do that. And they're
I,
sort of okay with that, but
I
like,
remember when you sent me through those initial ideas that you had, and I think they were just quite plain, but it's amazing what it
mm,
does to the piece. And this is why at the moment the way it is, that raw sound, um, I'm quite happy with the way it is, knowing what's to come almost, which is
yeah,
quite exciting really. It's
I
like
think it's
almost
been a
the
big,
next phase of it, isn't it?
totally, yeah. I think it's something I've really learned, that like, the production and the manipulation, the processing side of it. I mean, it can bring so much to the table that I think you have to be quite, hold your nerve really sometimes and be really simple with what the material is, and
Mm.
not get too complex too soon, because there's sort of a wealth of variation kind of waiting for you with the production, and you want to kind of really show off what the production is doing, and for that, you need quite a focused sort of starting point and sound. So it's yeah, it's fascinating. Like it's one of these things where I think it's going to be next 10-20 years of really finding all the nuances and different kind of applications of how it might work, and finding the processes that work specifically really well for saxophone. Like I think I found things like chorus distortion, delays, they work really well, but then other things possibly not. So
Mhm.
it's almost relearning how to orchestrate, but with production as opposed to
Yeah,
mixing it with other instruments. So
yeah.
it's a massive, yeah. It's one of those, and yeah, I think it will keep me entertained for a very very long time. But
What
no,
about your journey into it? Because I know your music as a saxophonist and as a performer of the music, the physical music. What was the journey into the experimenting more with that electronic sounds? Is it something more recent, or is it something that you've dabbled in the past?
yeah, I think to be honest, it was, so I never really into it to begin with. I mean, I had a little sort of multi-tracker at home that I used to play around with. But then when I went to RCM, I sort of, I guess, learned orchestration in that sort of sense. But then when I came out of RCM, I quite quickly got into writing a lot of music for media. So basically had to very quickly learn like, how does Logic work. And I think suddenly realized that, learning just how to mix stuff and produce stuff myself, it was like, oh, hang on a minute, I feel like I'm doing the same thing in Logic that I'm doing in Sibelius orchestrating. I'm just using different sets of tools, so you're kind of, it's that same thing of how do I make a melody sit out? Well, I have a whole process to do that in an orchestration way, and then now I have a whole new process to do that in a kind of mix and production way. So I've always sort of weirdly thought those two things as being quite a similar kind of process. And then I think I've sort of dabbled in a few pieces of adding, you know, in post-production, and adding things and adding kind of specific kind of elements to kind of craft a more specific sound, like, so like, you know, making sure that I'm adding reverbs on something or a distortion pedal on something. But I think a big game changer was when I did a piece with Parrot Orchestra called Craftwork Rework, where they asked me to essentially live process. They close mic'd the acoustic orchestral instruments and then said, you know, would I play around with processing the live feed, so adding in filters and delays and stuff like that in real time, which it's quite a long time we sort of did that, but actually it's been a massive sort of eye-opening learning curve of like, oh wow, this actually, yeah, this really works. It really adds a whole new dimension to sort of the orchestral timbre, but also just this idea of thinking of production in a very creative way, as opposed to just, I'm just going to EQ my drum kit. You know, it instead of it sort of being a balancing process, it's a completely creative process. And yeah, it just feels like you've just sort of found a whole new way of orchestrating, basically, and a whole new way of experimenting and finding a more specific kind of sound, I guess. So yeah, I feel like I'm still very much at stage one of about stage, you know, like, because there's so much to get your head around. I mean, every single plugin and process has, you know, years of history to it. Like even just a reverb plugin, you know, you think, well, where does that plugin come from? And it's come from this studio and that technique and this microphone and that, you know, I mean, it is mind-boggling, I think, the kind of the wealth of knowledge that is kind of wound up in these things. And it's almost like I'm learning the orchestra all over again, but just in a production sense. It's that, I think, that huge of a kind of undertaking. So yeah, every time it's an experiment, every time it's a like, and I've got some very lovely engineer friends who I'm always like, can you do this? Like, does that work? Like, is it okay?
You find that
But
more
it's
often than not the
exciting.
answer is yes, you can do it. Because I remember having a similar conversation with the sound engineer when I was in the studio recently doing one of the other pieces, and he said, "Yeah, you can do whatever you want. Just tell me what you
Yeah,
want to do, and there'll be something that gets that sound." Which is
it
great,
gets
isn't
to
it? Because I
that.
guess that's
Yeah,
just infinite possibilities, then, isn't it? There's the palette is
totally.
huge to adjust the sound, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it comes back to like, you know, it being idiomatic, I guess. You know, there are things that you would write for violin that you'd say, yeah, that really, you make the absolute most of what a violin is able to do if you write in that kind of way. And I think it's the same with this sort of stuff, you know, as I found, like, you know, violin pitch through a distortion pedal doesn't really work, like doesn't really do it, you know, for various kind of reasons doesn't work, but then other things do. So it's kind of this, yeah, it's sort of, again, I think just finding what is idiomatic and what is interesting. And but it, yeah, the possibilities are quite literally endless, I think. Like, yeah, it's, as I say, it gets a bit mind-boggling at times of, of like, oh my gosh, I could do this, isn't it?
Kind
But
of
no,
brings me on to.
it's really, oh sorry.
Sorry, I think we might be out of sync a little bit. It kind of brings me
Oh
on
yeah.
to the whole thing about performing this piece as well that you're kind of writing from it. What is your take or thoughts about that live performance? Do you intend it to be performed live, or is it a case of you getting hold of this recording and manipulating it, and that's it, what what it is? Or do you see that there are some challenges? There's obviously going to be challenges, but do you intend it to be played live? Is there a way of doing that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's a completely ongoing kind of, there's so many composers and we're all in the same position of like, you know, yeah, a recorded version of what we're doing with processing. How does that translate live? And yeah, I think there's still so many questions to sort of answer in that regard. I mean, I could imagine this being done live with to backing, so you know, to having a speaker system wherever you're performing, kind of thing, with the kick drum, and then maybe a set of pedals that you're playing into a mic, and they're doing the processing for you live.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it could work live. I think it could be a thing live, but obviously it just would mean a different setup for you as a player. But then I think, again, this is where it gets quite interesting, because I think it's sort of, you know, if I, all the processing that I would do in my, you know, Logic or whatever file, if I then boil that down and say, okay, it's a chorus effect, it's a reverb effect, it's a delay, what my setup is going to be different to your setup as a player. So then the piece is actually going to sound quite different if you do it through your setup as opposed to where I start off with. So I think it's a really interesting like sort of dialogue that composers and players are going to have for a long time now. Like, you know, how prescriptive are you? Like, how do you just sort of say the recorded version and that's it? Because I don't want there to be any other interpretations. Like, I, you know, want it to be really specific to that kind of sound that I've created. Or do you actually be a little bit more open with it and say, okay, in the way that as soon as you give a player a piece of, you know, if you give a player a piece of Bach, they interpret it in their own way, and does that then apply to what you're doing with processing? So yeah, I think it's a kind of ongoing, we're all trying to still figure this out and kind of find the best ways of doing it. But what I like about it though is that I think it means that it's a much more collaborative process with players. You know, I think it's a lot more there's a lot more dimensions to what it is that you're asking of a player. You know, you're not just asking for an instrumental performance, you're then asking for a whole setup of things. So there's going to be pros and cons about that with different people, but yeah, I think it just opens up an interesting discussion, and also, like, you know, in that sense you're then a composer and a producer because you're producing the sound and using that kind of electronic approach for it. So yeah, at what point is the composer the producer and at what point is the performer the producer? It kind of creates a very interesting sort of meeting point. So yeah, I don't think I quite have all the answers.
No,
Yeah.
no. I love the fact that it's even though it's got this electronic um, part to it, it's still open to that interpretation. I've never thought of that actually. The fact that the setup could be different, and that could in turn affect the way that it's performed. That's quite interesting
Yeah.
because you've got different levels of interpretation. You've got the physical thing of the player actually playing the music, and then the electronic interpretation of that as well, isn't it? Isn't it? And then
Yeah.
two kind of things come together, but from the composer as well. So it's like another dimension to add to the level of interpretation, isn't there? That's quite interesting,
Totally,
actually.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's nice as well, like this idea that like I feel like we're all going to continually be in this cycle of, you know, we start off with something human and we want to make it electronic, and then we have something electronic and we want to make it more human. And like,
Yeah,
you know, and like pieces like this are kind of examples of that, where it's inspired by electronic processes. You know, it's inspired by arpeggiators on synths and stuff like that, which is a very electronic kind of process, but then you're emulating that in a human way, but then, you know, and then adding in the processing. So yeah, it's this kind of constant dialogue, I think, which is, as I say, I just find it really interesting because I think it puts everything within a different context.
hmm
And you kind of, yeah, you do have to decide how much you're willing for someone to kind of make it theirs. But I mean I'm totally cool, you do what you want. Like I always think it's really interesting when you give players stuff and they kind of put their own spin on it. Like I always like that. But yeah, I think it's just a really exciting time for this kind of hybrid. I mean, I'm just about to release a new notation method for all of this called Clectro notation. So it's sort of classical electronic notation, which kind of comes back to all of these things of, you know, if the production is such a key part of what it is that you're playing, that should be properly represented on a score and, like, you know, included in that sort of artistic process as much as everything else. So it's yeah, I think we're going to be talking about this kind of thing more and more, and it's, yeah, it's exciting, it's sort of overwhelming and exciting all at the same time, I think, when you're writing it.
Yeah.
But no, I can't wait to like hear you, yeah, get the final thing
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
see you
Yeah. Well,
perform it live. Like that would be amazing.
yeah. Yeah.
Be really cool. I think
That's
as well, because like so much, oh sorry, I
no.
keep doing
Sorry.
this,
Go on.
down.
Go on.
I was gonna say, like, so much electronic music like is actually made to make people dance. You know, like the whole point of a lot of electronic music is to create this drama and this kind of, you know, you'd be in a club, you'd be somewhere dark, you'd be somewhere loud. You know, it's that kind of vibe, and I think it's kind of cool to not forget that, you know, and to kind of bring that drama into the piece. So yeah, no, it'd be fun.
Yeah. That sounds really exciting as well. The fact that you've started to develop that notation for that. Because it's interesting
Yeah.
looking at the score that you sent me. There's still quite a lot of words, isn't there? Things like modulation wheel gliss. Um, I'm just trying to look for another, like an echo. I mean, that's a pretty standard one. The slap tongue kind of thing, that the gliss from a slap tongue, the bending. So it's that idea that the player is trying to emulate that electronic sound, and then the electronic sounds are being mapped over the top. Is that what you mean? To give the performer an idea about what might be happening to the sounds that they're playing at that moment.
Yeah, I think so. I think like, anything that's kind of or sequence of bass, like it's the idea of again thinking, oh, well, what is a sequencer? What is a synthesizer? What tools and language do they have, and would they use? And synthesizers, obviously, so many synthesizers, their main goal is to sound like an instrument. So it's a kind of nice flip, I think, to be like, well, how can I make my instrument sound like a synth and kind of, do it back essentially.
Yeah.
And I mean, I love things like modulation wheels. Like it gives you it's such a cool sound. It's such a cool kind of tool, I guess, to have this kind of idea that you get these lovely perfect curves of sound. And it's a nice sort of thing to be thinking, and the sort of ballpark to be aiming for, I think, for a player to be like, instead of just asking for a gliss, ask for a modulation wheel gliss, because then immediately you're thinking, okay, well, it's really smooth, it's really, it's very sort of mechanical in the way that it's done. Which, I mean, did you kind of look at that differently as a gliss? If I'd just written gliss or written
Yeah.
modulation with a gliss, like,
Yeah.
did it make you
And
think
quite interestingly,
different?
I've visualized myself moving that modulation
Yeah.
wheel,
That's cool.
instead of just thinking, yeah, because I mean, with that kind of thing, it was a long time to be moving this gliss over a semitone, and I think one of them is just a quarter tone, so it's a long time for you to be moving that gliss. But with that word of a modulation wheel, you can feel that it's that physical movement of something rather than I'm moving from this to this, and it's just that line.
Mm, yeah,
So yeah, I think it does make you think of it different. And I think all of
definitely.
those conversations that we've had in the build up to the piece being written and being recorded and what you're going to be doing to it, I think that also helped as well, because there was the conversations about what was possible, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I just looked on this page. This is probably quite a good example because it says here big fat bass sound. And that made me think differently of how I was going to play it. I wasn't going to be subtle whatsoever. I wasn't going to try and make the nicest sounding bottom B, which is quite a nice thing to see as a saxophonist, because to make that bottom B sound nice is quite tricky.
Yeah.
But then there's certain words that you use there as well. So getting increasingly more distorted, wild, harmonic series, heavily distorted, lots of growls, harmonics. That sort of language is something that you don't usually look at, or you don't usually see when you're
Yeah.
performing something. There might be something like growls, but that kind of electronic language coming into that sort of playing is really quite interesting. Um,
Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? Like I was very lucky. I studied with Mark Turnage at LCM, and I remember him saying, because he does it in his scores, he just has the best like adjectives in his scores, like spiky or growly or that kind of thing. And he said, well, I why not? Because like I know the vibe that I want, I know how I want it to sound. I'm not going to then translate it into another language or try and find something that fits or gives a ballpark of it. He's like, I'm literally just going to write how I want it to be. So,
yeah, yeah, be as plain as you
which has
can.
been,
That's a composer's job.
yeah, it's been such good advice, because I always have in my scores, I always, and it's amazing actually, like the discussions that I've had with players because of that. Like I remember one, I think I wrote like twisty on a melody, and it opened up this really interesting discussion about how do you make the melody sound twisty, and like in my mind it was like, well, it's kind of coming in and out with like how much breath you're using and kind of making the notes bend, and so and they kind of came at it from a completely different perspective. So yeah, I think it can just be a really good starting point to just find something different, I guess, in how you approach it. Um but yeah, no, I've always followed Mark's advice of just write it how you hear it, like just write what you want. So yeah, expect lots more crazy directions on your scores.
Nice. No, I like it. I like it. Definitely.
Oh, amazing. It's
Oh,
gonna be so cool, Chris.
the only
Oh,
other
I'm
thing that I'd like to ask is,
yes.
how do you say the name of the piece? Because I know that it's sequence, but just shortened, isn't it?
Yeah,
SEQ. Is
I
it
guess it's just
SEQ?
seek. I think it's
Seek.
seek. Yeah, seek or SEQ. I really liked it because there was some definition. Hang on, I'm gonna double check this. I'm always really interested in like etymology of words and like where things come from. And I think it means something like to follow or something, this idea of a sequel or like,
Yeah.
but I think that's a really nice sort of thought. Oh yeah, was it the following or something like that? The following one or something, which is, yeah, it's cool. I kind of like that as an idea, especially in terms of thinking in like the way the piece is structured, where it starts with a motif and then gets more and more, that kind of thing. Um, so yeah, I guess we go with seek. Also, I just think it looks cool. Like I like the shape of words.
Yeah, I like it.
Yeah.
So there you have it, a quick catch up with Charlotte on the project that we're working on together. The new piece of music called Seek is going to be featured on my new album coming out in the summer called Overflow. I'm really looking forward to the next stage of this project. So as I mentioned, it's an ongoing thing this. I've sent the raw recordings off to Charlotte. It's her job now to manipulate those sounds even further, send them back to me and see if anything else needs adding to it. Really also looking forward to this new notation that Charlotte's working on that's going to help incorporate these electronic sounds into more acoustic playing, something I'm really interested in and more than happy to be a little bit of a guinea pig really at developing that notation and getting it out there. I'm also planning on doing some more instructional videos on some of the techniques that you'll hear in this piece of music when it does come out in the summer. Things like the slap tongue, different types of slap tongue though, so sliding between different notes using that slap tongue. Glisses, we mentioned that modulation wheel effect that appears in this piece of music. I'll be doing a little bit on that. There's also other little areas in there where we have growls, we have a more distorted sound that's produced by the player and not the electronics. And also that really interesting one of singing certain notes while you're playing a different note, and that sort of effect that comes out with that as well. Might even do a little bit of work and show you how I actually recorded that, because it was quite good fun in the studio actually. We had to mic up the instrument and me a little bit differently just to get those sounds across in the recording. So that's all for now. The best thing to do is just to say keep an eye out for more videos that are being released in the future on this project and other projects, and I look forward to seeing you next time.